Hi, everyone. It looks like we are still waiting for a couple of the registrants, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I will go ahead and just do a little bit of housekeeping things before I turn it over to Anne Marie. There are a couple things that you'll be getting after the presentation. So it will be the slide deck and then a document that Anne Marie will talk about here in a minute. And then there will be a link to a survey with the Northeast Document Conservation Center. They have a specific post-program survey that they would like us to fill out. So all of that and the link to the recording will be in a follow-up email. So look forward to that. I will go ahead and most everybody has their camera and their microphones off. We'll just ask you to keep it that way so we can all see the presentation a little bit better. But feel free to ask questions in the chat during the presentation, and I'll be monitoring that as well as Anne Marie for anything. There's going to be a couple breaks that we can answer some of those, and then we'll also probably have time at the end for that as well. One other thing, let me pull up this. I just wanted to go ahead and let you all know that we will have 3 more sessions. I had to do the good math in my head of this series with NEDCC. So next week we will be talking about exhibits, and then we also will have one on a community scanning day, and then an oral history. So those are the 3 that we have left in the series, and we want to give them a big thank you for hosting that this month as our pre-conference series. But I'll go ahead and introduce Anne Marie and let her take over the presentation. Anne Marie is the Director of Preservation Services for NEDCC and has worked as a professional in the field of cultural heritage preservation for 20 years. Under her oversight, the NEDCC Preservation Services Department has provided guidance and instruction to institutions across the United States about preservation of paper-based, photographic, digital, and audiovisual collections. So thank you, Anne Marie, for joining us today, and I will go ahead and hand this off to you.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here with you today for getting ready for preservation grant season. I have a lot of information for this hour-long presentation, and so I'll be moving along, but as Sarah said, there is time integrated into the webinar for some questions and also some time at the end. So this is an overview of where we're headed together. I'll first talk about where to find preservation grants. I'll talk about the types of eligible projects that are typically associated with those grants. I'll give you some tips on applications, and then leave you with some really clear next steps for what you can do as soon as the webinar is over. So first, let me get started with an overview of preservation grants. There are 2 places that I suggest you look for grants. The Foundation directory online is now hosted by candid.org, and it has, actually, let me just minimize there. It has all sorts of grants actually on it, not just grants for preservation, which is my focus today. The reason I'm mentioning this to you is because 90% of US foundations don't actually have their own websites. So you're not going to find them. You're not going to find those funders necessarily with an internet search. I do want to let you know that this foundation, the foundation directory, is available by paid subscription. So there's different payment plans. $50 a month, cancel at any time is one of them. So sometimes people will subscribe for about a month, do what they need to do in terms of research, and then cancel the rest of their subscription. They know that people do that, that's okay. But your public library often subscribes or has a subscription. So honestly, I would check there first. A second place you can look is NEDCC's website. We have a funding opportunities page that has state, regional, federal, and foundation grants. It's not comprehensive, so it's not everything, but it's all related to cultural heritage and preservation. So you can take a peek at that. There's not, we don't have a big listing for Missouri, to be honest. So I just want to be upfront about that. So these are some big names that I want you to know. Um, you've probably heard of them. Many of them are government agencies or they're national organizations. And I'm going to share a slide on each of them, actually, and the grants that they have with a little bit more information. I encourage you to review each of those slides that are coming up later, and especially go to their websites to understand more about the grant programs that they offer. It's worth a little time on your part to find a grant that's a really good match for your project. So I'm guessing that if we were all in a room together and I said, have you heard of some of these funders? I would see heads nodding. So they are the big names. So here's my info slide for IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services. They have a number of grant programs, more than you see even here on this slide, although these are good matches for preservation projects. You can see there's well, let's see, I've listed 5 here and 4 of them have the word museum in them. So, and the award amounts range from 5,000 to 250,000. So some of these grants require a match, some of them don't. Like I said, there's a wide variety. So if you have a project that's a good fit for one of their programs, I encourage you to apply. NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, also has a number of grant programs. The 2 I've listed here are a good fit for preservation projects. The Preservation Assistance Grant, or PAG, P-A-G, is a smaller amount grant that is really good for discrete projects like assessments or short pilot projects, things like that. Compared to the other grants, the PAG application is less complicated. It's still going to take you a while to pull it together, but it is, I think, perhaps the easiest grant application that I'll be looking at or mentioning today. So we'll talk about how to plan for your application in a little later. The NHPRC is the granting arm of NARA, the National Archives, and they have grants for archival projects and also well, I'm just looking at the application deadline. So some of these grants have this optional draft deadline. So you can see there's an optional draft that was due in August, and then the final application due on October 6th. And usually the grant applications tend to occur at the same times every year. So if you haven't already started on this grant, you won't be able to pull it off by October 6th, but you can plan for next year, for example. And I want to make sure you know that the Missouri Historical Records Advisory Board does provide assistance for NHPRC grants. So they will help you, there's some assistance they can provide with the application process. They are happy to review your drafts 45 days prior to the grant deadline, which is a good boundary to have. So they have time to give you some really good feedback and you have time to make your application even better. So you're lucky. Not all states provide that kind of support. But if you're going to go for an NHPRC grant, then be sure to get the different different states actually pronounce this acronym, but I'll just say the MHRAB assistance from them. It's harder to pronounce in Missouri, I think. MHRAB. Another big funder is CLEAR, the Council on Library and Information Resources. Their digitizing hidden special collections and archives grants are for digitizing rare and unique content, stewarded by collecting organizations in the US and Canada, actually. These hidden histories include, but aren't limited to, those of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color, women, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, and other genderqueer people and communities, immigrants, displaced populations, blind, deaf, and disabled people and communities, and colonized, disenfranchised, enslaved, and incarcerated people. So if you have collections that highlight any of those communities, those might be deemed hidden collections and they might qualify for this grant. CLEAR also has a Recordings at Risk project, which is targeted to audio collection preservation. 9 cycles of awards just wrapped up this year, but it sounds like there will be future cycles of recordings at risk. So if you have audio collections that need help, and most audio collections need help, keep an eye out for the CLEAR Recordings at Risk, the return. Speaking of audio collections, here's 2 more audio grants that you can look at later. One's from Grammy, and the other is from the National Recording Preservation Foundation. One thing I've been noticing, and you can see that about particularly this one at the bottom, they haven't given any awards since December of 2020, and they're not saying when their next cycle is open. So there are a few grants where it's unclear if they're continuing or not. So I've updated this slide deck for this presentation. This is the current information. And in many cases, there's an email address where you can register your emails so that they'll alert you when they've announced another round or a deadline or even just the availability of the application materials. I want to highlight the Museum Assessment Program. It's not an outright grant. You're probably familiar with it, but it does result in an assessment with preservation recommendations. And that's an outcome of some of the other grants I'm talking about. This is just another way to get that kind of service and benefit. NEDCC does have a MAP peer reviewer on staff. Her name is Stephanie Garofolo. She'd be happy to work with you if you happen to apply for a MAP. For the MAP program. On this slide, I've listed 2 Missouri-based grant programs that are not preservation grants. However, sometimes when you seek funding for an exhibition or other program, it's a good opportunity to use a small amount of your own funds for preservation and conservation activities that are related to the project but not covered by the grant. So do you follow? So for example, if you receive a grant for an exhibition, you might upgrade some of your exhibit lighting at the same time or seek conservation treatment for a few items that'll be on display. And in this way, you can take preservation actions incrementally over time and protect your collections in conjunction with other grants. So note these details as you research funding opportunities and read through the grant guidelines. For some, your institution or your project will be ineligible right out of the gate. Pay attention to deadlines, but especially note when a required letter of inquiry or a draft application is needed earlier than the deadline. Some grant programs have deadlines for an optional draft review, and I suggest you take advantage of this opportunity if it's available. It's always good to get someone else's opinion about how your application can be made stronger. Some grants have a minimum amount, and your project may not be big enough to be considered, so you want to pay attention to that. And a matching funds requirement means that you match the grant award with an equal amount of your institution's own money, or sometimes there's an in-kind option where you're contributing your institution's staff time or there's some other in-kind contributions towards the match. So I'm going to pause at this point. I'm going to take a sip of water. If you have any questions about finding projects, please type those into the chat. I'm not seeing anything pop up in the chat, so I'm going to keep on going. On to the next section. So the next section is eligible projects. For any grant, you're going to want to check the eligibility of your project and the eligibility of your institution. Almost without exception, you must be a nonprofit to receive the kinds of grants that I'm talking about today. Usually they're looking for nonprofit cultural heritage institutions that support research or scholarship or education by providing access to their collections. So we do, NEDCC does work with a wide range of institutions, and there are some institutions that don't actually yet provide access to their collections yet. They don't have a research reading room or any way for researchers to use their materials. They don't mount exhibits or anything because they're not quite at that point yet. If they're not providing access, they're usually not eligible for these grants. Eligible institutions also include federal, state, and local agencies who have a primary function of cultural heritage. Sometimes people think, well, I'm a, a state organization. Maybe I'm not eligible for state grants, but you totally are most of the time. Also, Native American tribes and Native Alaskan and Native Hawaiian organizations are eligible. So it's a good idea to have your IRS determination letter and your employer identification number handy when you're trying to determine your eligibility. If you're unsure, I will say that you can always contact the grant program if you're unsure about your eligibility, but stay on their good side and thoroughly read the application material before you call them and ask them. Because if your question is answered in the application materials, they're going to expect you to find that yourself. So I want to say a few words about eligible collections. So it matters what collections you focus on. I know of one organization whose grant application was denied in part because their collection was of regional importance rather than of national importance. And that's what the grant required, was a collection of national importance. So you'll want to pay attention to that. On this slide, you'll find some of the common characteristics of collections that are attractive to funders. Of course, those that are aligned with their goals. Oftentimes there's an emphasis on national importance. All of the funders are interested in amplifying underrepresented communities and narratives, trying to right some of the wrongs of past underrepresentation. Funders are usually attracted to at-risk materials, including nearly obsolete AV materials or items that are in really poor condition. They want to help you with those items that are just about to come to the end of their usable life. You can often make the case for high use collections, both collections that are currently in high use or collections that you expect high use of in the future. For example, I worked with a town that had an anniversary coming up. It was a New England town that had like a 400-year anniversary of their founding. And so they were anticipating greater use of certain collections as the town was approaching that anniversary, celebrating that anniversary, and going through that anniversary. So they were able to make the case in a grant for doing some work with those collections. And then also you can often make the case that there's some added value. You might have a collection that would be more accessible or functional, like through digitization, for example. Something that is really popular, but that maybe you're really isolated and difficult to get to. It's expensive for researchers or the public to come and use this particular thing, but you would be able to digitize a surrogate that would meet most of their needs. So there are cases you can make, as you can see. So after you've researched the eligibility of your institution, the eligibility of your collections and projects, or rather just of the collections, you can start brainstorming about projects. So I've got some tips here on this slide for you to come back to later, but you're going to want to scope your project. Are you making a product? Like, are you making an exhibit? Are you publishing a book or something? Are you creating workflows? Are you creating capacity through a pilot? Are you presenting a program, public education program, or gallery series or something? Once you're thinking about that, talk to your partners. Consultants and your project partners can help you further shape your project and also contribute to writing the application. Sometimes they've got the words that can explain certain aspects of why this particular area of research or this particular collection is important. Enlist a subject area specialist to help you explain the need and significance of your project. So if you don't have somebody on your project team who can do that for you, be in touch with a subject area specialist and say, can you help me articulate, what it is about whatever it is that you're focusing on in your collection. That is so important. And you can call the grant officers early on. They will help make sure that your project idea fits their funding priorities. They're very careful. They're not gonna tell you whether or not you're gonna get funding or not. You have to go through the process like everybody else. But if you're off track, they'll help pull you back on track. And sometimes they throw out a few ideas, of things that you could do. They're not saying that you have to, but they'll give you some additional information. It can just be useful. They're very busy near the deadlines. So that's partly why it says to be in touch with them early, because a lot of people are calling near the deadline. So again, stay on their good side and, be proactive and early. So here I've listed some example project ideas. These are only a few of the activities that these larger grants I'm talking about will fund, but they might inspire you. So plan to review this slide later. Read the grant guidelines carefully so that you know what the funders will allow. And as I take another drink of water, if you have any questions on eligibility, please do type those in the chat. So we have a question in the chat. In your experience, can some or many of these grants be used for salaries? We have enough projects to do, just not enough people to do them. So I would like to apply for grants to pay someone to come and do the work. So it's actually, I'm going to answer this as two different questions. A lot of the grants can be used for salaries, or that can be used as part of your match if that's what's required, if the grant requires a match. But virtually all of these grants will pay for consultants or contractors, which is a second way. So because you're saying you don't have enough people. So whether those are new positions, salary lines can be, or using salary of existing staff can be a little, I'm not as much of a slam dunk, but hiring in like a term position or a contractor, paid interns, that kind of thing, virtually all of these grants will do that. And in fact, that's a strategy that clients I've worked with have taken, where it takes 1,000,000 years to get a new staff line approved, but they can hire like as many contractors as they want. So they're getting a lot done using outside contractors. So I hope that answers your question. You're going to want to read the fine print in every grant, but yeah, I think you'll find that you've got the ability to get the people power to do all those projects that you have. Yeah, that these grants can help you with that. I'm going to move on to some application tips. So first and foremost, you have to understand the grant you're applying for. There's usually a ton of information on the grant website. You're going to want to read it all. If you don't know where to start, you can ask a grant program officer, where should I start? Like what's going to be most helpful for me? And they can point you in the right direction. So listed on this slide are some of the questions that you should answer as you review grants. So some of these are things that can trip you up later. For example, asking for letters of support. You need to do that in advance if they're required, because you want to give your supporters enough time to write a really nice letter for you and not be calling them at the last minute for a favor. The budget is honestly something that often trips me up. Grants usually have a specific budget form they want you to use, and some of them are really, really detailed. Like they want to know which employee is traveling from what airport to what other airport for how many days, Are they staying, just and the date, so it's like you pull out your crystal ball and you're trying to do some travel projections. I find that very difficult. Also, I have ways of sort of when you're planning a project, right? You're sort of thinking about the budget and the different project components and how it all fits together. Usually the way I'm thinking of the project is not the way the budget form is designed. So I have to translate, my budget into the budget form. So, just learn from my experience that you're going to want to take a peek at that and be prepared. You might need to request quotes from vendors. You might need to research travel costs and so on before you're actually able to complete the budget form in the way that they want you to. Remember that you can usually get feedback on any of your past grant applications, and I encourage you to do so. You can ask for the reviewers' comments, and that's whether you got it funded or whether it wasn't funded. Some of the best reviewing feedback most helpful feedback that I've received was actually on a grant that was awarded to me. And normally I'm thinking, well, like I hadn't previously really asked for feedback on grants that were funded because I figured I did it all right. But, there still were some things in the reviewers' notes that I found helpful. So let's see here. I think that's all I'll say on this particular understanding the grant slide. You'll see the title on this one is Gather What You Already Have, and I have the little recycle symbol on here. Grant applications have some commonalities for sure. So in addition to describing your project idea, you'll need to describe your organization and its mission. Chances are this is already written down somewhere. So gather that information and reuse it as much as you're able. Most grants require a short description or profile of your organization. You probably have something like this on your website already, or maybe it's in a recent annual report or something. Just make sure that it's an updated version and you can plug it into your grant application. Again, website annual reports are great places to look for descriptions of your primary collections and your primary services. You'll likely need that information regardless of what grant you apply for. So go ahead and pull it together, put it all in a grant information folder so that you can find it when you need it. No reason to reinvent the wheel, none at all. And then depending on your project idea, you may be able to collect some statistics that support the need for your project, or you may already be collecting those statistics. So figure out who in your organization has access to usage statistics, or the number of annual visitors, the number of annual research requests, the number of website visitors, the number of classroom visits, those kinds of things. And you'll know from the list I just gave, those are usually different people in your organization. Like the person with the website statistics is usually not the person with the classroom statistics. So figure out who has what so that you can ask for updated stats when you're ready to write. If your project has anything to do with digitizing collections or offering collections online, you will likely need to provide some sort of digital preservation policy. You need to show that you have sufficient technology infrastructure to sustain the digital materials over time. No grantor wants to give you money to do digitization and then have you lose the files that they paid for. So that's usually part of the application as well and might require you to talk with your IT folks. And of course, review any of your past grant applications, press releases, reports of all kinds, anything where you've taken time to carefully express the purpose of your organization. There's probably language there that you can reuse. Articulating the project design is an important part of your grant application. So take a step back and think about the project as a whole so that you can come up with a logical timeline and then pad it a little bit. So review the questions that are on this slide as you plan, especially get the buy-in from the people who will be doing the work. The folks who are doing project management for the entire grant, all the way to the person who's managing just the money. Everyone in between needs to be informed and on board as you're designing your project. In fact, we're actually looking at a grant right now. It's not a grant, it's a project application, I guess I would say. And we've pulled in one of our staff members who has archives experience, because there's an archives processing component to this project. And that person has a really good sense of how much time is required, how many people are required, how much space, physical space is required to process a collection, that kind of thing. So, pull in the right people, get them on board, and benefit from their expertise. Remember that funders usually require you to share the products of your grant project, and you might need to articulate how you're going to do that, how you will provide access to the public at the end. So this might include information about your outreach efforts, about how the content would be made available, how the products of the grant will be integrated into your existing collections and your existing programs, that kind of information. So it's definitely to your advantage to show that you're being thorough in your planning by thinking of the things I've got on this slide. Your budget is also, of course, a key part for your project planning. Basically, the costs associated with the activities that you describe in your grant narrative should be represented in the grant budget. This could be fees for contractors or consultants, like I mentioned before. It might also include the cost of any supplies or equipment that you're purchasing, and costs for travel and for shipping those supplies, actually. For any item that's in your proposed budget, make sure it's an eligible cost in your particular grant. Because sometimes as we're building the project, there's other costs associated with the project, and you're thinking, oh yeah, I forgot about that, and you're adding it to the budget. Make sure that everything is actually eligible within the grant. Sometimes some of those costs need to be pulled out and paid some other way if they're not eligible expenses. Something else to keep in mind is that if you're requesting funding for supplies or equipment, these should be well described and up to preservation standards. So if you've discussed equipment or supplies with a consultant, or if you have recommendations from a paid preservation assessment, it doesn't have to be paid. That was the wrong word, like a past preservation assessment report, then you'll have the product information and the product specs available. So go back, take a look at those from an assessment report or any conversations you've had with a consultant, and that will help you give an accurate listing and an accurate price in your budget. So I find it helpful to know what's expected and how I'm going to be evaluated before I enter any sort of competition. So beyond following we'll call them the rules of the grant program and answering each question on your application, this slide gives some general guidelines for evaluation that your grant reviewers will be using to select the projects that they will fund. Many grants also provide rubrics, the actual rubrics, the rubric that the evaluators use to evaluate your application. So make it easy for the reviewers, because you can see, like, the worksheet that they're going to be given. Connect the dots, make it easy for them to see that the things that they're looking for on their rubric are in your application and that you are meeting the grantor's requirements. Aim to think like a reviewer when it comes time to write parts of your grant narrative. Ask yourself some of the questions that the reviewers will be asking themselves as they read over your application. Like, well, whatever's on the rubric, of course, but then things like, why is your project important at this particular time? Is this project achievable? Try to anticipate their questions and the possible points of confusion or concern, and address them preemptively, proactively. Remember that the panelists who are reviewing your application, are usually from peer institutions, and they come from varied but related backgrounds to yours. They are likely to understand your work, but they're going to be thinking about your institution from an outside point of view. So what is it that they need to know or understand about your project, your institution, your region, the collection? And then what is it that's actually extraneous in terms of the big picture? So think like a reviewer. I'm sure this is on another slide, but I will say have somebody else read your draft and approach it as a reviewer, as somebody who doesn't know about, your institution. So here's some more do's and don'ts. I'm going to leave these here for you to read through when you review the slide PDF later. But the red words along the bottom are really crucial. So it's very important, and here it is, that others read your draft, and then you make further edits. And you can see here it says write, review, rewrite, review, rewrite. So there's a suggestion here that you might be writing it 3 times, which is probably about right. If you some of these grant applications have page limits or character limits, and so then you're trying to express what you need to express in a very, very, very concisely. It can be quite a challenge. So be sure to leave enough time for that step. Simply applying for a grant is an exercise in project management. So in a moment, I'm going to share a checklist with you that you can organize all of the steps. But first, let me just tell you, you should plan to submit your grant application several days in advance. I suggest you do what we do at NEDCC. We set a false deadline that's a week or 2 in advance of the real deadline. This has saved me more than once. Every once in a while, like somebody really key gets really sick or something, and you end up losing a week, or all kinds of things can go wrong or pop up that's a surprise. And so having that extra buffer is going to really save you. So once you've set your false deadline, then just work backwards. And identify the component parts of the project, lay them out on a calendar, and take note of who's going to be responsible for what. And take note of any holidays, any vacation plans, if someone's going to go off and get married and go on a honeymoon or something like that. All of those different factors are part of your planning so that you can have your application ready and ideally submit it early. And because honestly, sometimes the grant portals, not so much anymore, but particularly in early days of the internet, the grant portals sometimes would crash or they just technical glitches. They're more resilient now, but I got to tell you, stuff still goes wrong. So a word to the wise. Okay, I'm going to move on to next steps here after I take a sip of water. If you have any questions about the project planning piece I just talked about, feel free to type those in the chat. All right, your next steps. So this is the slide that you're gonna want to come back to. In fact, you might just print this one out and pin it up to your wall if you're applying for a grant. The first bullet is very important, which is why I've listed it first, and I'll give you a little bit more information on the coming slides. It has to do with SAM.gov and Grants.gov. The next 2 bullets I'll talk about now. Those are from an earlier slide that recommended gathering the material that you already have, such as a short profile of your organization, descriptions of your primary collections and programs, statistics that support your need for the project. Also try to determine how much time the project activities will take so that you can budget accurately. You might choose to do a small pilot project and record statistics during a project that's similar to what you're proposing. Like the last time we did an exhibit on this scale, it took X hours, of research, X hours of cradle making, X hours for installation, whatever. If you have those statistics, you can use them and to sort of extrapolate for your new project. Many grants will ask for resumes of participating staff members. These are usually limited to like 1 or 2 pages. And in my experience, a lot of my coworkers, their resumes might be longer than that, or they haven't updated it since the last time they applied for a job, which was a while ago. And so I would say go ahead, ask your your coworkers or whoever's going to be involved potentially in the grant to create this shorter version of their resume, 1 or 2 pages, and have it updated. And then you'll have it on file in that little grants info folder that you're creating. You may want to take a grant writing class, and I have a suggestion in the resources section at the end of this presentation. Individual grants often present informational webinars, and sometimes there's like a Q&A period where you can ask questions of program officers, like live, as part of the webinar. So look for those. I will say, like IMLS, they have a YouTube channel, and they have a little like 30-minute video tutorial for all of their grants, I think, almost. So look for that, or look for the YouTube logo, when you're on the funding page, the funder page, to see where you can link out to. And of course, you should research grant opportunities. I put this last because sometimes people miss the opportunity to cross out some of the other things on this list right at the start because they just go down the rabbit hole of trying to find the perfect grant. But in the meantime, you could be doing some of these other things as well. So like I said, print it out, stick it on your wall, and use this to guide some of your early steps. At NEDCC, we use a checklist to organize our grant applications. So I want to tell you more about that. We developed a checklist for the NEH Preservation Assistance Grant because many of our clients find that grant is a good fit for their projects. It's a maximum of $10,000 in most cases, and it's just right for like a consultant's assessment visit or assessment of your exhibit spaces or all kinds of sort of discrete projects. So I have given Sarah the 2023, I think we've updated, no, they haven't released the grant guidelines. So I gave Sarah the 2022 checklist. I'm pretty sure it's the 2022 checklist, and she'll be sending that out to you, making that available. You can use it as a template. It's a Word document, so you can just save it to your desktop and edit it to your heart's content. You can make it into a checklist for any sort of grant. And even if you don't actually use it as a template, I would encourage you to just take a minute and read through it because there might be a few things on that checklist that you forgot about that you're going to want to make sure you incorporate into your planning. The checklist, and you can see just sort of the beginning part of it here, it demonstrates that a grant application typically has many components, and there's a good chance that you yourself don't have all of the information. So like I've said before, you're going to have to ask others in your organization to work on specific parts of the application. You're going to have to set deadlines for them, and then you're going to have to follow up. So just be prepared for that. Some of you may be familiar with the DUNS number, which used to be required for federal grants in the US. As of last April, the federal government stopped using the DUNS number. Instead, it uses the new Unique Entity Identifier, or UEI. So just in case you hadn't heard, I wanted to make sure you knew, you'll notice that registering with SAM.gov and registering with Grants.gov are at the top of the checklist. Let's see, yeah, line 2 and line 3. So here's more about that, because this is now the second time I mentioned it. If you're interested in any of the US federal grants programs, then getting a UEI number and registering with Grants.gov is crucially important. Grants.gov is the official portal for all federal grant applications. And to submit an application through the portal, you need your organization's UEI number, and you'll need to make a profile for your institution and complete some other pieces. Which brings to mind, if your organization has applied for grants, federal grants before, then your organization may already have a profile on the webpage. So just make sure that you're not going off as a lone ranger, but you're talking to people in your organization who might know what the login and access information is, so that you're not somehow duplicating work that's already been done. So what you do, you go to Grants.gov. If you need to start fresh, you click on the Applicants tab at the top, which I've circled here, and then you choose Organization Registration from the options on the page. And you'll come to a web page that tells you exactly what to do. So I added a step 0 to the top, which is to find your organization's EIN. I mentioned before, that's the employer identification number, which is what an organization, you get it when your organization forms a legal entity, such as a nonprofit organization. If your organization doesn't have an EIN, then you'll need to apply for one through the IRS website. So that's step 0. Then register with sam.gov to get a UEI number. Just that's right here, step 1 on the slide. It only takes 1 day to receive it. It's going to take 7 to 10 days for the entire SAM registration to be processed to be complete. But the good news is you'll have your number within a day, which is great because then it won't hold up your grant application process. With your UEI in hand, then you can create a Grants.gov account. I want to draw your attention to the note at the bottom of the slide. If your Grants.gov account is inactive for a year or more, then your password might expire. So don't assume that you still have access. Log in and check. And this is a lesson learned by organizations that NEDCC has worked with. We've had folks who got stymied at the last minute because their account had expired. Once you're registered with SAM and Grants.gov, then you can work on your grant application online, and you can upload documents as you get parts of the application done. And then when everything is done, you can look it all over and then you submit it. So it's great because you can work on within the portal over time. Other grants generally require you to register in some way as well. Sometimes all you're doing is sending a letter of intent, but others, such as this CLEAR website, there is a registration process. So start that as soon as it's available for your chosen grant. In this case, the registration portal becomes a grant project tracking tool. So once you're registered for CLEAR's digitizing hidden collections grant, you'll have like a dashboard and a checklist for putting together your grant application. So it becomes a tool that you can use. Other grants require you to put together an application package and just email it to the program officer. I always say it's worth introducing yourself in advance, ahead of time, just to say, even if they're not requiring a letter of intent, you could just say, hi, we're so-and-so, we're such and such a museum, and we're going to be applying, for this grant. Just wanted to say hi. That's okay to do. Once you've got a project in mind, then decide if you're going to collaborate with any other organizations or if you need the expertise of a consultant. In either case, you're generally going to be asked to provide what's called a letter of commitment from that organization or from that consultant that outlines how they would participate in your grant project and usually how much it would cost. It is important that you begin discussing your ideas with these folks early on in the planning process, just so that all the parties can understand what the timeline is and that sort of thing. Do not, under any circumstances, include a collaborator or a consultant in your grant application without their knowledge. That's not cool. On this slide, and the one we just saw, has some tips about consultants that you can review. I didn't read through the last slide, and I'm not going to read through this one because you can read through them when the time comes if you're working on a grant that involves consultants or collaborators. Just note that when you talk to a grant program officer, they're not going to typically recommend specific consultants. That's a conflict of interest, but they can offer advice on the types of qualifications that you should be looking for in a consultant for your type of project. So that can be helpful if you're, feeling a little at sea. Remember also that once you're in touch with a consultant or consultants trying to determine who's going to work best for you, you can ask them for references. That's perfectly acceptable. And feel free to ask other, peer institutions that in Missouri or elsewhere, who they've worked with, and would they recommend them. I'm going to end with a couple of additional resources that will help you along the way. So this is the slide I showed you at the beginning with the information about the foundation directory. Remember to check your public library. And also the NEDCC funding page, which is easy to remember because it's nedcc.org/grants. Candid.org has more than just the foundation directory. They have learning opportunities too. NEDCC recommends the free Introduction to Proposal Writing that they offer. They offer this class live a few times every month, or you can choose to do it as a self-paced class. It's also offered in Spanish, and it's going to take maybe an hour or two of your time is what they estimate. Some of their other training programs and resources are fee-based, but sprinkled among them are a lot of free webinar recordings, self-guided courses, and online resources. So you might explore their website. NEDCC has 3 recorded webinars on funding topics. These are in the preservation training playlist on our YouTube channel, and you can see the 3 titles listed here. If any of those interest you, go to NEDCC's homepage, click on the link in the, I think it's in the upper right, and we have the links to all of our social media. It'll take you off to our NEDCC YouTube channel, and it's on the preservation training playlist. And then, as I mentioned earlier, many grantors offer webinars and recorded videos about their funding opportunities. So this is the IMLS playlist that I mentioned earlier. It's been updated for fiscal 23. And like I said, I think there's a video for every single grant there. And some of them are just like grant information. Some of them are more tutorial focused. And of course, the live ones usually have a live Q&A. So as we come to a close, I'm going to take questions that remain. And as Sarah mentioned, she'll be sending out the Word document of the NEDCC grant checklist, a PDF of the slides from today, so you can pin them up on your wall as reminders, and also the link to this webinar evaluation form. It's for the whole series, and you can check which webinar you attended today and then give feedback on it. We do appreciate your feedback. Where some of what we do is grant funded too, so it's always helpful for us to know how we can do better work and how we're meeting people's needs. And as I mentioned, I'm happy to take any of your questions at this point in the chat, or Sarah might unmute you, I'm not sure. In general, at NEDCC, you can always reach us at info@nedcc.org. This is our main phone number here, and we have a rotation of staff. There's always a conservator on call every day and a preservation specialist on call every day for questions, that come up over the main phone line. And you're welcome to sign up for our e-newsletter if you would like to be in the loop. It's a monthly newsletter. That's all we do with the mailing list. So you won't be peppered with emails, but you'll just know the most important things. And of course, you're welcome to follow us on social media. So I'm going to take one more sip of water, and I do have 5 minutes to answer any questions if you want to pop those in the chat.
Thanks, Anne Marie. Like you had said, I do have the 22 form of that checklist. So I double checked in my email while you were talking. And then, like I said, all of that will come as one follow-up email here with the recording of the session, all those documents for you all, and the evaluation form link will be in there as well.
That's great. Yeah, the checklist is based on the NEH Preservation Assistance Grant, and they are not releasing their next grant guidelines for a couple of weeks. So we haven't updated the checklist yet. Yeah, so that makes sense. You've got 22, and that's as good as it gets right now until they release their new info. It usually doesn't change much. And in fact, when you go on the funder websites, they'll usually say, the current application cycle is closed, but feel free to look at, the application materials from last time. And we're warning you, they might change. So don't go too far down the rabbit hole. But the reality is they usually don't change that much. So you'll be well on your way. Well, I can see that a few folks have already stepped out of the room. Those of you that remain, if you have questions, you're welcome to type them in the chat, and you can always follow up. If you email the info@nedcc.org and you say, I was, at the Missouri Association of Museums and Archives. Sorry, I just sort of blanked there on the words that actually go with the acronym. That I was at that webinar on such and such a date. And, it was about grants. They'll make sure that your question gets to me. So thank you so much for being here. And I wish you much success with all of your grant applications, and let us know if we can help.
I will go ahead and stop the recording because I think a few people have went off, but